Some encounters change a life. Others change history. But there are encounters that seem to open, for a moment, a window between heaven and earth. The day probably began like any other. The sun was already warming the hills of the Zora region. The wind slowly swept through the wheat fields and made the leaves of the olive trees dance in silence. Nothing indicated that this morning would be different. Manoah's wife was perhaps busy with simple tasks, those that repeated day after day. Fetching water, preparing food, taking care of the house. Routine has this curious characteristic. It convinces us that tomorrow will be the same as today. But the story of the Bible reminds us time and again that God usually acts exactly when no one is expecting it. Without trumpets, without crowds, without spectacles. It was in this seemingly ordinary setting that something extraordinary happened. The text of Judges 13 says simply, "The angel of the Lord appeared to the woman." A short phrase, almost discreet, but it raises one of the biggest questions in all of biblical theology. Who was this character? When we hear the word angel, we usually imagine a celestial being created by God to deliver messages. And many times that is exactly what we find in the scriptures. However, there is a character who appears several times in the Old Testament and seems to act differently. The text calls him the angel of the Lord. In Hebrew, the word used is malach, which simply means messenger. This is important. The word describes a function, not necessarily the nature of the one sent. That is, every angel can be a messenger, but not every messenger needs to be just a common angel. This is exactly where the mystery begins. This wasn't the first time the angel of the Lord had appeared. Centuries earlier, Hagar, lost in the desert, met this same character. Later, Abraham spoke with him before the sacrifice of Isaac. Jacob had similar experiences. Moses met the angel of the Lord in the burning bush. Gideon also received his visit. Now, we arrive at the story of Samson. There is an intriguing detail. In several of these episodes, the text starts by calling this figure the angel of the Lord. But, as the conversation progresses, the narrative shifts to speaking simply of the Lord. This change has always caught the attention of scholars. How can a messenger speak so directly, as if the very voice of God were present? Throughout the history of Christianity, different explanations have emerged. The first understands that the angel of the Lord is an angel of extremely high rank, sent to represent God with total authority. In the ancient world, an official representative spoke on behalf of the one who sent him. His words were treated as if they were from the king himself. This interpretation has a foundation in the cultural context of the time. However, there is another very well-known reading. Many Christian theologians, especially since the early centuries of the Church, understood these appearances as manifestations of God Himself before the incarnation of Christ. This interpretation is called a Christophany, meaning a pre-incarnate manifestation of the Son of God. It seeks to explain why, in some accounts, the angel of the Lord accepts worship, speaks with divine authority, and is identified by the text itself as the Lord. It is important to state something clearly. The Bible never explicitly claims this was Jesus before being born in Bethlehem. That conclusion belongs to the interpretation of many Christian scholars. It is old, respected, and widely disseminated, but it remains a theological interpretation. Our commitment will always be to carefully distinguish what the text states from what different traditions understand about it. Regardless of how one interprets the identity of the messenger, one truth remains. The initiative comes entirely from God. The woman was not looking for a vision. She was not performing a ritual. She was not climbing a mountain in search of revelation. It was God who came to her. This is a hallmark of the great biblical stories. It is God who seeks Abraham. It is God who calls Moses. It is God who sends Samuel. It is God who meets Gideon. It is God who appears to Samson's mother. There is a profoundly theological truth here. Before any human being seeks God, it is God who takes the initiative to seek the human being. The messenger looks at that woman and declares something impossible. You are barren. You have never had children. But you will become pregnant. Imagine the impact of those words. She had probably already learned to live with that pain. Perhaps she had stopped hoping. Perhaps she was no longer making plans. It's curious how human hope usually dies in silence. There isn't a specific day we give up. We just stop believing. And it is exactly at this point that God speaks. This dynamic appears repeatedly in the scriptures. When human hope reaches its limit, the divine narrative is just beginning. There is a philosophical lesson hidden in this scene. Human beings normally build the future by looking at probabilities. God acts according to promises. We ask, what are the chances? The biblical narrative asks, what has God promised? They are completely different ways of viewing reality. This does not eliminate reason, nor does it despise intelligence. But it reminds us that biblical hope is not born of circumstances. It is born of trust in the character of God. This is perhaps one of the deepest differences between optimism and faith. The optimist believes that everything will work out. Faith keeps walking even when everything seems to go wrong. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. The messenger didn't just announce a birth. He gave detailed instructions. Instructions that would begin even before the child was conceived. The mother was to change her own way of living. Drink no wine. Consume no fermented drink. Eat no foods considered unclean. And the boy must never have his hair cut. Why? Why would God establish these rules before birth? What did it mean to be a Nazirite? Did the hair possess some supernatural power? Or was it just a symbol of something infinitely greater? The answer to these questions will lead us to one of the oldest and least understood institutions in the entire Bible, the Nazirite vow. And to understand this vow is to understand the true secret of Samson's strength. Samson's strength was never in his hair. It was in the covenant that his hair represented. If there is one image that has crossed centuries when we think of Samson, it is this: a man with long hair. For a long time, paintings, films, and illustrations reinforced the idea that those strands were almost a source of supernatural energy. As if the strength were hidden inside them. As if cutting his hair was akin to unplugging a machine. It is a powerful image. But that is not what the Bible says. In fact, when we read the text carefully, we realize something much deeper. The hair was never the center of the story. It was merely the symbol of something invisible. And to understand this, we need to go back hundreds of years before Samson's birth, to a little-known text in the book of Numbers. In Numbers 6, we find the description of a special vow, the Nazirite vow. The Hebrew word used is Nazir, which means separated, consecrated, or dedicated. This detail completely changes our understanding. Being a Nazirite didn't mean possessing special powers. It meant belonging to God in a particular way. It was a public declaration, a life set apart for a purpose. Normally, this vow was temporary. Men or women could take it voluntarily for a specific period. At the end of the vow, they offered sacrifices and cut their hair as a sign of its completion. But Samson was different. Very different. He didn't choose this vow. He was born into it. Before he even took his first breath, God had already separated his life for a specific mission. This makes Samson a unique case in the scriptures. His consecration did not begin by a personal decision. It began by divine initiative. The Nazirite vow involved three main prohibitions. First, no consuming wine or any product derived from the vine. Second, no touching corpses, preserving ritual purity. Third, never cutting the hair during the period of the vow. These three requirements seemed strange, but they all carried profound meaning. Wine, frequently associated with joy and celebrations, represented the voluntary renunciation of certain pleasures in favor of a greater mission. Avoiding corpses served as a reminder that God is the source of life and that the consecrated person should remain ritually pure, according to the law of Moses. The hair, in turn, made the consecration visible. Anyone could look at a Nazirite and realize that their life had been separated for God. It was a public testimony. Silent. Constant. Every day, when looking in the mirror, Samson would be reminded of who he was. Or at least, that is what was supposed to happen. There is a very human tendency to confuse symbols with what they represent. Think of a wedding ring. The metal doesn't create the marriage. The absence of the ring doesn't automatically destroy the love. But that object reminds you of an invisible commitment. The value is not in the gold. It is in the covenant it symbolizes. Samson's hair worked the same way. It did not contain strength. It pointed to a consecrated life. When Delilah ordered it cut, she didn't remove a magical object. She destroyed the external sign of a covenant that Samson had already been violating internally for a long time. This detail is decisive. Samson's fall didn't happen in a single night. It was being built over years. The cutting of the hair only made visible a rupture that already existed in his heart. There is something extraordinary in the way God works. Before handing over a mission, God establishes an identity. It was like this with Israel. You will be my people. It was like this with the prophets. It was like this with the disciples of Jesus. And it was like this with Samson. Before facing any Philistine, he needed to know who he was. Because identity comes before purpose. And purpose comes before action. When this order is reversed, life loses direction. Perhaps that is why so many people today live busy, yet deeply lost lives. They know what they do, but they no longer know why they do it. The Bible insists on a different logic. First, God declares who you are. Then, He shows you what you must do. Modern psychologists recognize something that ancient religious traditions had already intuited. Symbols shape behavior. Uniforms change posture. Rings remind us of commitments. Flags awaken belonging. Objects carry meanings that go beyond their practical function. Samson's hair fulfilled exactly this role. It reminded him daily that his life did not completely belong to him. He carried a mission, a responsibility, a covenant. But there is a danger. When we live with a symbol for a long time, we can forget what it represents. It is possible to wear a wedding ring and fail to honor the marriage. It is possible to attend a temple and turn away from God. It is possible to know the rituals and lose the heart of the faith. Perhaps Samson lived exactly this tragedy. His hair kept growing, but his awareness of its meaning was diminishing. We live in a culture fascinated by appearance. Many people invest enormous energy in looking strong, competent, spiritual, successful. The story of Samson asks an uncomfortable question. What sustains that appearance? Because no image can substitute a life. No symbol substitutes a covenant. No gift substitutes character. That is why the biblical narrative never simply glorifies strength. It continuously asks, who are you when no one is watching? That is perhaps the true measure of a life. But there is still one detail. The angel of the Lord didn't just explain the vow. He revealed something even more surprising. That boy, even before he was born, would receive a mission. He will begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Notice the choice of words. It doesn't say he will finish the deliverance. It says he will begin. Why? Would Samson be unable to finish his mission? Or was God already revealing that the liberation of Israel would be a story much larger than the life of a single man? This small phrase opens a door to the entire biblical narrative. Because God rarely carries out his plans through a single generation. He writes his story throughout the centuries. And Samson would be just one of the chapters in that much larger work. In the next chapter, we will meet Manoah, a sincere man, full of questions and profoundly human. Through him, we will see that, often, God does not condemn our doubts. He simply invites us to walk until faith sees what the eyes cannot yet see. Not all doubt is born of unbelief. Some is born of a sincere desire to understand what God is doing. Up to this point, the narrative seems to have been driven by a single voice. The voice of the messenger. The promise. The impossible being announced. The woman who couldn't have children. The birth that defies logic. But now, for the first time, the focus shifts. The story turns to a man who, until now, was silent. Manoah, the husband of the barren woman. If there is something curious about how the Bible introduces him, it is precisely this. He doesn't receive the first visit. He doesn't hear the initial promise directly. He enters the story later. As someone who hears an extraordinary account and needs to process it all. And here begins something deeply human. The woman returns and tells him what happened. She saw the messenger, heard the promise, received detailed instructions about the son who hadn't even been conceived yet. And Manoah does something many of us would do. He doesn't reject it immediately. But he doesn't blindly accept it either. He asks for confirmation. "O Lord, let the man of God whom you sent come again to us and teach us what we are to do with the child who will be born." This phrase reveals something important. Manoah isn't just curious. He feels responsible. Because divine promises aren't just spiritual events. They have practical implications. A special child requires a special upbringing. A divine mission requires human understanding. The biblical text says that God listened to Manoah, and the messenger returns. But here's something interesting happens. The messenger doesn't appear to Manoah first. He reappears to the woman, as if the narrative were reinforcing a silent point. God is not limited by the order of our expectations. He doesn't follow human protocols of authority. He continues to act where and how he wishes to act. When Manoah arrives, he finds the messenger again, and he repeats his questions. What will happen to the boy? How should we raise him? What will he do? And the messenger simply reaffirms the instructions already given. Nothing new is added. No secret information. No additional revelation. The message was already sufficient. There is something profoundly human in this scene. Manoah wants to understand the future, wants to organize the details, wants to know what to do before things spiral out of control. This is not weakness. It is human nature. The human brain handles uncertainty poorly. That's why we seek explanations, plans, structures, guarantees. But there is a limit. Not everything can be controlled, and not everything needs to be understood in order to be lived. Manoah is facing a divine promise, but he is still trying to fit it into human categories.
Hey guys, a quick pause before we keep going. If you're enjoying the video so far, show our channel some love. Leave a like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. When you interact, like, and leave a comment, it lets us know that you're liking our work. That's what motivates us to keep bringing you more cool videos. So go ahead and comment down below what you're thinking, and let's get back to the video.
At a certain point, Manoah offers a sacrifice and asks the messenger to stay. The messenger accepts, but then something unexpected happens. When the sacrifice is offered on the rock, the messenger ascends along with the flame and disappears. This detail completely changes the tone of the narrative. Now we are no longer dealing with a simple message. We are dealing with something that transcends common logic. Manoah realizes this immediately, and he says something revealing to his wife. "We shall surely die, for we have seen God." Here appears one of the deepest tensions in biblical spirituality. The encounter with the divine generates fascination, but also fear. The woman's response is one of the wisest in the entire narrative. She essentially says, "If the Lord had meant to kill us, He would not have accepted our sacrifice, nor shown us all these things." It is simple logic, but profoundly theological. She understands something that Manoah is still processing. God does not manifest Himself to destroy, but to reveal purpose. Manoah represents a very important dimension of the human experience. He is not an unbeliever. He is careful. He wants to understand before he acts. But the story suggests something subtle. Not everything will be understood before the first step. Some answers only appear along the journey. This is one of the great tensions of biblical faith. The need to trust even without full comprehension. The chapter ends with a simple detail, but an important one. The boy has not yet been born, and yet, the story is already full of meaning. This is unusual in the biblical narrative. Normally, the impact of a life is seen after the life has happened. Here it is different. Before birth, there is already a promise. There is already purpose. There is already direction. Now everything is ready. The promise was made. The messenger appeared. The instructions were given. The tension was established. But the most awaited moment is still missing: the birth. In the next chapter, we will finally see Samson arrive in the world. But the most important question won't be how he was born. It will be what was already happening inside him, before he even opened his eyes for the first time. Some stories don't begin when life begins. They were already in motion long before that. Throughout this entire episode, we have talked about promise, about impossibility, about silence, about a messenger who crosses a common woman's routine to announce something extraordinary. But now, for the first time, the promise ceases to be an idea. It becomes flesh, breath, crying, life. The biblical text summarizes everything in a few words. Simple, direct, almost discreet. And the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. No dramatic details. No grand descriptions. No attempt at exaggeration. The Bible doesn't need that. The birth itself carries enough weight. The name Samson comes from the Hebrew Shimshon, frequently associated with the word Shemesh, which means sun. Some scholars understand the name as a symbolic reference to light. Others associate it with the idea of strength and brilliance. Regardless of the exact interpretation, one point remains clear. From the beginning, his life carries a striking identity. He is not born as someone ordinary within the narrative. He is born as someone set apart within history. The text continues to state something equally important. The boy grew, and the Lord blessed him. This phrase may seem simple, but it contains one of the most profound principles in the entire Bible. God does not just call, He sustains. The promise doesn't end at birth. It continues in development. This means Samson did not grow up alone. There was something happening in the background, an invisible direction. A silent preparation. Here begins one of the central tensions of the entire series. Samson is born into a promise, but this doesn't mean his life will automatically be coherent with that promise. This is one of the great complexities of the biblical narrative. Calling does not eliminate choice. Purpose does not eliminate responsibility. God establishes direction, but the path still needs to be walked. And it is exactly here that the story begins to split into two lines: what God wanted to build, and what Samson will choose to live. There is something important that many people forget. Samson has not yet demonstrated his strength. He is still a child, a young man growing up in an occupied land. Nothing extraordinary is visible yet, but the narrative is already preparing us for something. Because the Bible doesn't just tell what is happening, it anticipates what will happen. It is as if the text were saying, "Pay attention. Something is being built here." The Spirit of the Lord begins to manifest in him gradually, not as a spectacle, but as direction, impulse, purpose. This is important, because Samson's strength is not presented as a trained skill. It is described as something that arises when necessary, as if it were connected to a greater purpose. But we still don't know how this works, and that creates expectation. And then, the narrative does something unexpected. It jumps forward in time, without explaining everything, without filling in all the details. Samson grows up, and the reader is left with an uncomfortable feeling. Something is about to happen, but we still don't know what. The text ends this moment by saying that Samson begins to stir between Zorah and Eshtaol. Two places, two directions, a subtle sign, as if his life were about to leave the stability of childhood and enter something much more complex. He hasn't entered battle yet, but he is already approaching the conflict. And here we close the beginning of the story. not with a conclusion, but with a preparation. Because Samson will not be remembered only for his birth. He will be remembered for the choices he makes when he grows up. And these choices are starting to be drawn now. In the silence. Before the action. Before the battles. Before the fall. In the next episode, we will see Samson fully grown. And finally, the promise begins to meet the real world. A lion will appear on the path. And for the first time, we will see Samson's strength manifest. But the most important question won't be about the lion.